A young Marine once celebrated in Washington with the Silver Star runs from the spotlight into the mountains. In an abandoned cabin, he uncovers his grandfather's hidden past secrets of war, betrayal, and healing. What begins as escape turns into a fight for truth and survival. If you want to follow every twist of this journey, glory, loss, and rebirth, make sure to like this video and subscribe for the full story. The summer heat pressed down on Washington like a heavy hand, but the parade ground shimmered with polish and ceremony. Flags whipped against the morning sky, brass music rang out bright and relentless, and Ethan Cole stood at attention in his dress blues. The Silver Star gleamed against his chest, pinned there minutes ago by a general with rehearsed gravitas. The applause roared a sound he could feel more than hear, a storm of hands clapping for the image they saw, not for the man beneath the uniform. Ethan kept his posture rigid, his face composed, but inside his stomach twisted. The metal weighed like a stone. He remembered the day it was earned sand fire and the sound of men screaming. Not glory, but survival. And yet here he was, polished into an icon. Cameras flashed, freezing him into a photograph that would circulate for years. Grace. His younger sister stood off to the side, eyes wet with pride and worry. Ethan caught her gaze for a second and almost let the mask slip. Almost. A congressman finished his speech praising courage and sacrifice. Then, as the stage lights shifted, his father stepped forward. Richard Cole was a man bred for podiums, his suit impeccable, his voice tuned for microphones. He gripped Ethan's shoulder with a practiced hand, the smile already spreading across his face. The crowd hushed. "This is a proud day for our family," Richard declared, voice booming. "A proud day for America. My son has shown his valor in combat." And now he paused for effect, knowing the rhythm of performance. Now he will continue his service here at home. Ethan will join me in our mission to bring integrity back to Washington. This is only the beginning of his public life. The applause returned sharper, a new wave of excitement. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching, cameras clicking. Ethan blinked hard, stunned, his jaw locked to keep from breaking the silence with a protest. His father hadn't asked, hadn't even hinted. The decision had been made without him, carved into stone before the words left Richard's mouth. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, not with pride, but with a cold rush of betrayal. He stood there trapped between cheers and lenses, knowing the narrative had already been written, war hero to political heir. His pulse hammered louder than the band. He wanted to say no, wanted to walk off the stage, but the weight of uniform and expectation pinned him in place. His father's hand pressed down harder, as if to steady him or claim him. Ethan's eyes flicked once more toward Grace. She shook her head, a tiny movement lost to the crowd, but he saw it. She knew. The anthem struck up again. The crowd rose and Ethan lifted his hand in salute. His lips formed the words, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in desert nights and memories of men who would never walk this stage. The cameras caught a hero. Inside, Ethan felt only the chill of chains tightening around him, forged not in battle, but in family ambition. The long dining table glowed under a chandelier older than Ethan himself, crystal glasses lined up like soldiers' polished silver catching the light. His father sat at the head posture, commanding voice rich with satisfaction. To Ethan, Richard proclaimed, raising his glass of red wine, a son who embodies courage, honor, and the future of this family. The others lifted their glasses dutifully. Ethan sat between his mother and Grace, still in his uniform, because he hadn't had time, or perhaps hadn't dared to change. His throat tightened around the toast, and when he raised his own glass, the crystal trembled slightly in his grip. His mother, Eleanor, kept her eyes low, her fork sliding vegetables across her plate without eating. She had always been the quiet center of the family, speaking less, but seeing more, and tonight her silence felt heavier than words. Grace across from him wore a smile, too brittle to last, her eyes rimmed red, a tissue crumpled discreetly in her hand. She nodded at him once, as though reminding him to hold steady. Richard continued, his voice like a gavel. "The press response has been extraordinary. They see in you what I always knew, a leader, a man of conviction. We cannot waste this momentum. Tomorrow I'll have my staff prepare a schedule of appearances. A senator's seat is not far if we move swiftly." He looked directly at Ethan, waiting for agreement, not invitation. Ethan forced a swallow of wine, the burn doing nothing to calm his stomach. "Dad, I never said he began, but Richard cut him off with a laugh. You don't need to say it, son. History calls. It's in our blood." Grace's fork clattered against her plate. She quickly covered it with a napkin, but the sound drew attention. "I just think," she said softly, "maybe Ethan needs time. He just got home." Richard waved the suggestion away as if brushing dust from his jacket. "Nonsense. The best way to heal is to channel his strength into service. The public needs heroes, and Ethan is ready." Grace looked down, tears spilling silently while their mother reached to place a hand over hers beneath the table. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes: resignation, compassion, helplessness. The meal passed with words about strategy, future campaigns donors who had already called. Ethan barely tasted the food. He felt the metal's weight on his chest like a stone pressing against his lungs. Later, when the plates were cleared and the family dispersed, he escaped to his old room upstairs, where childhood trophies still lined the shelves. He pulled off the jacket, let it fall onto the bed, and reached for the folder left in his duffel bag. Inside was the after-action report from that day overseas, the document that had secured him the Silver Star. He had not been able to read it fully before, but now under the lamplight he unfolded the pages with trembling hands. The words struck like cold steel. Phrases sanitized the chaos into sentences of valor. Lieutenant Cole led his unit with distinction under fire, preserved the lives of others through decisive action. He stopped, his breath catching. The names of the fallen were listed in small print, formal and detached. Among them was Sergeant Daniels, the man who had shoved Ethan out of the line of fire, taking the hit meant for him. Another was Corporal Ruiz, who had covered the retreat, holding the line until the last possible second. Ethan remembered their faces, remembered the shouts, the dust, the moment his ears rang with silence after the blast. They had died, so he could live, yet the report framed it as his command, his courage. The medal pinned to his chest downstairs was built on their sacrifice, distorted into a story of his heroism. He pressed the papers flat, his hands shaking. His father's words from the table rang in his ears. The public needs heroes, but what if the public's hero was built on a lie? Ethan felt the truth clawing at him, a truth he could never share on a podium or in a campaign. The Silver Star gleaming for cameras was a mirror he could not bear to look into. He stared at his reflection in the glass case of his childhood trophies. The boy who once dreamed of making a difference was gone, replaced by a man paraded as a symbol while his heart carried the weight of the dead. Grace's muffled sobs drifted faintly from down the hall, as if she too bore the burden in silence. Their mother's quiet presence at dinner replayed in his mind a woman who knew the cost of ambition, but had long ago surrendered her voice. And his father spoke of legacy of power, never once asking if his son's soul could bear the crown. Ethan closed the report, slid it back into the folder, and sat on the edge of the bed, the metal burning against his chest. He pressed his palms to his eyes, but the images of Daniels and Ruiz refused to fade. Outside, Washington hummed with lights and expectations. But inside the room, Ethan Cole felt like an imposter dressed in borrowed honor, chained not by neglect, but by the sweet iron of family pride. The storm broke over the city like artillery sheets of rain slamming against the streets, lightning flaring across the skyline. Ethan pulled the collar of his uniform tighter, though the fabric was already soaked, and climbed into the old Jeep he had kept since training days. It coughed to life, reluctantly, headlights cutting a narrow path through the downpour. He did not tell anyone he was leaving, not Grace, who had cried for him at dinner, not his mother, whose silence spoke more than words, certainly not his father, who had already begun planning his political ascent. Ethan drove without a destination at first, only the need to escape the weight pressing down from every direction. But memory carried him north toward the Appalachians, toward Iron Hollow, the name whispered in family stories like a forgotten chapter no one opened. His grandfather, William Cole, had lived there after returning from World War II, a place no one visited anymore, a cabin left to rot among the pines. Ethan gripped the wheel harder, rain blurring the windshield, the highway empty, except for him and the ghosts he carried. Hours later, tires ground onto gravel roads winding into the mountains. Darkness pressed thick around him, broken only by the sweep of headlights over dripping branches and rusted mailboxes. Finally, the Jeep shuddered to a stop in a clearing where the outline of a structure leaned against the storm. The cabin sagged like an old soldier, its roof collapsed in places, windows shattered, porch boards warped and broken. Ethan stepped out, boots sinking into mud, uniform clinging heavy against his body. The rain stung his face as he approached, flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing dust rot and silence. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and thyme. Broken furniture slumped in corners, a fireplace filled with ash, decades cold. Yet as Ethan swept the beam across the room, something caught a wooden chest half buried under fallen beams. He shoved debris aside, muscles straining until the chest was free enough to open. Hinges squealed, and inside lay stacks of notebooks, their covers cracked but intact. He lifted one, carefully wiping grime from its leather surface. The initials WC were carved faintly into the corner, his grandfather's hand. Ethan opened to the first page and felt his breath catch. The handwriting, steady but haunted, spoke across 70 years. The nights do not end when the war ends. The sounds still come, the faces still stand at the foot of my bed. I cannot sleep without whiskey. I cannot wake without dread. Line after line described sleepless nights, sudden terrors, guilt over men who never came home. Ethan's hands trembled as he read words that mirrored his own secret nights. His grandfather, the stoic figure in faded photographs, had lived with the same shadows that now stalked Ethan's mind. The revelation struck harder than any battlefield memory. He was not alone in this torment, but part of a lineage scarred by service. Turning the pages, he found passages describing Iron Hollow itself. William had written of men who came quietly at night, veterans broken and trembling, seeking refuge. We patch each other together with what little we have, one entry read. Bandages morphine from surplus words we do not speak in daylight. Ethan frowned, scanning the rest of the cabin. The rain pounded harder, as though urging him deeper. He moved through a narrow hallway, boards creaking, until his light fell upon a trapdoor half hidden under a rug eaten by moths. He pulled hinges, resisting before snapping open, and a ladder led down into darkness. The smell of rust and antiseptic rose up. With slow steps, Ethan descended into a small, underground room. His beam revealed shelves lined with dust-covered jars, medical kits stamped with faded army insignia, and wooden crates marked with Red Cross symbols. Morphine vials still nestled in foam bandages, yellowed but preserved surgical tools wrapped in oilcloth. It was a field hospital frozen in time. His grandfather had not just hidden from the world, he had created a sanctuary for men like himself. A place to treat wounds the army forgot once medals were pinned. Ethan touched a rusted scalpel, felt the chill of its history. He imagined William bent over makeshift cots, treating broken bodies and haunted minds by lantern light. The cabin was not just a ruin. It was testimony, proof of a legacy. His father never spoke of a legacy that now reached for him. Ethan sat heavily on a stool, the journal still in his hand, pages fluttering as if alive in the damp air. His grandfather had written, "If my children ever find this place, let them know we were not cowards. We carried the war long after the uniforms were folded away. We did not choose this burden, but we bore it together." The words blurred as Ethan's eyes stung not from the storm, but from the recognition. His own medals, his own silence at dinner, his own nights of dread, they were not isolated weaknesses. They were part of a cycle passed down like an inheritance of sorrow. He closed the journal slowly, setting it atop the crate of morphine. The cabin groaned as the storm battered its frame. Ethan looked around the underground room, the relics of another war surrounding him, and felt for the first time a strange mixture of fear and belonging. He whispered his grandfather's name into the damp air, a plea, a confession, maybe both. The storm passed by dawn, leaving Iron Hollow wrapped in mist, the cabin dripping as if the night itself had tried to wash away its history. Ethan stood outside, sleeves rolled mud on his boots, surveying the broken roof and the sagging porch. The Jeep sat behind him, streaked with rain and dirt, its headlights long dead, but he did not care. He had nowhere else to be. He gathered planks from the fallen shed-hammered boards into place, nails squealing against old wood, his breath rising in white puffs. Each strike of the hammer felt like reclaiming something lost. The cabin creaked with resistance, but held as though it too wanted to rise again. Weeks turned into 2 months. Ethan mended the windows with plastic sheeting, cleared debris from the fireplace, and patched holes in the walls with scavenged timber. Sweat rolled down his face, mixing with sawdust, and for the first time in months, his mind grew quiet with the rhythm of physical labor. While clearing brush behind the cabin, he noticed steam drifting from between rocks near a ravine. Curiosity pulled him closer, boots slipping on moss, until he uncovered a pool of water warm to the touch, fed by a spring deep within the mountain. The surface shimmered in the morning light, carrying a faint mineral scent. His body ached from days of labor and years of tension, and against reason, he stripped down and lowered himself into the pool. Heat wrapped around him like an embrace, the knots in his shoulders loosening, his breath deepening. The silence of the forest merged with the hum of water. For the first time since returning from deployment, Ethan fell into sleep, not interrupted by gunfire in his dreams. Hours later, he awoke to birdsong. Instead of screams, his limbs light, his chest strangely free. He sat in the pool with tears on his face, astonished that rest could still belong to him. Rejuvenated, he returned to the cabin, driven to make it more than a ruin. While lifting rotted floorboards in the back room, his crowbar hit something metallic. The sound echoed unnaturally, and he froze, heart quickening. Digging deeper, he uncovered a sealed metal container, corroded but intact. With effort, he pried the waterproof tin open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were folders stamped classified and bearing Army insignia. Ethan's pulse raced as he flipped through the brittle pages. The documents described field trials, Operation Iron Hollow, dated from the 1950s. The language was clinical, detached dispersal of chemical compounds, test subjects drawn from voluntary veterans, monitoring for long-term neurological and respiratory effects. He read further, his stomach twisting as he realized the men who had come to his grandfather's cabin seeking treatment had not just been victims of war. They had been unwitting participants in secret experiments. The files listed illnesses, lung deterioration, tremors, hallucinations, the same conditions his grandfather had tried to ease with his hidden supplies. Ethan slammed the folder shut, bile rising in his throat. The land itself carried betrayal. His silver star weighed heavy again, but now not only with personal guilt, this was a wider lie, a stain buried in the soil. That evening, while sorting through the rest of the documents, headlights flared against the trees outside. Ethan's heart lurched. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, wary. A familiar figure emerged from a small sedan umbrella, clutched tightly Grace, who had traced his Jeep's last gas charge and the county deed records to find the cabin. She called his name, her voice fragile against the wind. He froze, torn between relief and dread. She hurried across the muddy clearing. Her shoes ruined her face, pale from the long drive. "Ethan," she gasped, gripping his sleeve. "You can't just vanish like this." Dad is furious. Mom is worried sick, and the press keeps asking questions. "Please come home." Her eyes searched his face, pleading. He shook his head slowly, the journal still on the table behind him, the classified files spread like wounds. "Grace, I can't. Not yet." She frowned, tears threatening again. "You don't understand. They'll destroy you if you stay here. Dad says people will think you're unstable, that you're running from responsibility." Ethan laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Unstable. For the first time, I feel steady." I found his words. Grace. Grandfather's words. He lived with the same shadows. And this place, it's not just an old cabin, there's truth here. Ugly truth. Things no one ever told us. He gestured toward the pile of documents. Grace stepped inside, looking at the cracked folders, the faded stamps. She picked up one page, her hand trembling as she skimmed the lines. Her eyes widened in horror. They did this. To their own men. Ethan nodded. And grandfather tried to help them. He built something here in silence, because no one else would. He took her hands gently, his voice breaking. Grace, in this hollow, for the first time since I came back, I can breathe. I'm not ready to leave that behind. She pulled away, biting her lip caught between love and fear. Rain began again outside, tapping against the patched windows like insistent fingers. She whispered, "Then what happens next?" Ethan looked past her toward the steaming spring, hidden among the rocks, toward the files that lay heavy on the table, toward the darkness that held both danger and answers. Weeks turned into 2 months as Ethan worked the ground with a borrowed spade, the soil hard with frost but still yielding to determination. His hands blistered, palms torn, but he pressed on, planting rows of potatoes and beans, imagining meals that might keep him through winter. The roof creaked overhead, patched but fragile, and each night he climbed to the rafters, hammering new beams scavenged from fallen trees. The rhythm of labor gave him focus, though his body grew gaunt, clothes hanging looser each week. At dawn, his breath smoked in the cold air, and at night the temperature dropped so sharply he lay awake, under layers of blankets, shivering even beside the fire. The solitude pressed on him, but it was an honest weight, far lighter than the clamor of speeches and microphones. He told himself this was rebuilding, not retreating. One afternoon he staggered while splitting logs, dizziness washing over him. He had eaten little but bread and thin soup for days, rationing what little he had left. His reflection in the cracked mirror showed sunken cheeks and dark eyes, a soldier turned into a survivor. Yet he pushed forward, refusing to abandon the fragile sanctuary he was shaping. Snow began to fall in early November, soft flakes at first, then heavier, covering the clearing in a white silence. Ethan shoveled paths, covered his small garden with tarps, and gathered wood in frantic bundles. The storm worsened until the wind howled against the cabin like a living force. He built the fire high, but the cold seeped through the walls, stealing his breath. That night, the storm reached its fury. The wind screamed through cracks in the wood snow piled against the door, and the fire guttered low despite his efforts. His limbs shook violently, fingers numb, chest aching with every breath. He tried to rise to add another log, but collapsed against the floor, his vision dimming. Memories blurred with reality, sand and snow mingling, gunfire echoing in the storm. He thought of Ruiz and Daniels, of his grandfather's journal, of Grace's tearful face, and then darkness pulled him under. When he awoke, warmth surrounded him. A lantern flickered, casting gold against the cabin walls. A stranger's voice spoke firmly, but with care. "Breathe slow, you nearly froze." Ethan blinked and saw a woman kneeling beside him. Her hair gray, her coat patched, her eyes sharp with practiced knowledge. She pressed a warm cloth against his forehead and checked his pulse with steady fingers. "I am Dr. Helen Ward," she said. "You should not be alone up here in a storm like that." He struggled to sit up, but she pushed him gently back. "Rest. You were minutes from hypothermia. Another hour and you might not have woken at all." Ethan's throat was dry. His voice cracked. "How did you find me?" Helen glanced at the boarded windows. "I've lived in these mountains a long time. Saw the smoke from your chimney before the snow swallowed it. I know this cabin. Knew the man who built it, too." Ethan stared, heartbeat quickening. "You knew my grandfather?" Helen nodded slowly, eyes shadowed with memory. "William Cole. My father served with William Cole in the Pacific, and after the war I worked with him here as a physician for veterans. Later, when the war ended, I visited him here. He made this place more than a home. He turned it into refuge." Her words unsettled him. Refuge for who Helen's gaze held his. For the broken. For the ones who could not march in parades, who could not return to families waiting with open arms. Some were deserters, soldiers who could no longer kill others, were men discarded after experiments no one admits to. Your grandfather gave them shelter, treated them when no one else would. She leaned back, her breath steady. He risked much. The army would have called it treason, but he called it duty. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He thought of the hood and medical supplies, of the files marked classified, of the journal describing sleepless nights. Now the fragments aligned into a portrait of a man carrying secret burdens for others. So the cabin was a sanctuary, Ethan murmured, voice low. Helen placed another log on the fire. Yes, a sanctuary and a graveyard. Some did not survive. He buried them out back, marked only by stones because he feared discovery. But he kept their names in a book. I imagine you will find it if you keep looking. Silence stretched, broken only by the fire's crackle. Ethan felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow, the weight of inheritance pressing on him more heavily than any metal. He looked at Helen, this stranger who knew his bloodline better than his own father seemed to. Why are you still here? She smiled, faintly sadness in the curve of her mouth. Because I too have ghosts. Because some places hold the truth even when people forget. And because someone has to remember what men like William Cole sacrificed when no one was watching. Snow still battered the windows, but inside the cabin a fragile warmth held. Ethan pulled the blanket tighter, staring at the old beams overhead. He wondered how much of his life was his choice, and how much was the continuation of a story written long before he was born. Winter loosened its grip slowly, leaving Iron Hollow wrapped in a thaw that smelled of wet pine and smoke. Ethan spent his mornings gathering wood with Dr. Helen Ward's help, his afternoons tending the fragile garden beneath makeshift coverings, and his evenings reading his grandfather's journal by the fire. Life had become a cycle of labor and reflection, steady but solitary. He thought the world beyond the mountains had forgotten him, but news has a way of traveling even without intention. One morning a knock startled him, a sound foreign to the cabin's silence. At the door stood a man in his late 50s, shoulders bent by years of work or war, cap in hand. I heard the man said awkwardly that there's a spring here. Folks say it helps with the pain. Ethan stiffened, suspicion rising. He glanced toward Helen, who watched quietly. At first, Ethan refused, saying the spring was nothing special, just water. But the man's eyes told a deeper story, eyes dulled by memories Ethan recognized instantly. Against his better judgment, Ethan led him through the trees. The man knelt by the steaming pool, dipping his hands, tears welling as if he had touched hope itself. When he left, he pressed Ethan's hand and whispered, "Thank you." More followed in the days after moving like shadows along forest paths. They were veterans, some older than Ethan, some young enough to still seem out of place in such sorrow, each carrying scars visible and unseen. They asked not for charity, but for a chance to soak in the warm water, to sit quietly, to breathe. Ethan struggled, torn between fear of exposure and compassion. He remembered his grandfather's entries, describing nights filled with visitors too broken for the outside world. Slowly, reluctantly, Ethan opened the cabin door, more often letting them in. He rationed supplies, shared blankets, listened to their stories in fragments. Helen reminded him softly, this was always a refuge. Perhaps it is again. One evening, as dusk sank into the trees, Ethan heard a gunshot echo faintly through the forest. Alarm surged through him. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, running into the snow-damp underbrush, heart pounding. Following the sound, he found a young man on his knees, near a cliff rifle at his side, his chest heaving. The boy could not have been more than 22, his uniform jacket still bearing patches, his face pale and streaked with tears. Ethan crouched carefully, speaking low. "You do not need to do this." The boy shook his head violently. "I cannot go back there. I cannot sleep. I see them every night. And they tell me you are the one who never quit." Ethan froze, recognizing the desperation. The boy's hand trembled toward the rifle again, but Ethan reached forward, steadying it with firm hands. "Look at me," Ethan said. "I am not what they write about. I am just like you. But if you end this now, all that weight wins." The boy sobbed, collapsing against him. Later, by the cabin fire, wrapped in a blanket, the young soldier whispered hoarsely, "You are our legend. If you give up, there is nothing left for the rest of us." Ethan sat in silence, the words pressing heavier than any metal. He looked at the boy's trembling hands, the eyes searching for something to anchor to, and he realized his presence had become more than survival. The men who came to Iron Hollow were not looking for miracles. They were looking for someone who understood someone who stayed. His grandfather had once filled that role. Now, unwillingly, Ethan was stepping into it. The days stretched, and the cabin filled not with noise but with quiet companionship. Men came and went sometimes, staying a night, sometimes longer. They left tokens, dog tags, photographs, small carvings of wood. The spring became a gathering place, steam rising around shoulders bowed in shared silence. Helen watched Ethan with a knowing gaze. "You see it now," she said one evening. "This place is alive again because of you." Ethan shook his head, but in his heart he felt the truth. The cabin had transformed. It was no longer just his refuge. It was becoming a sanctuary once more, a place for the forgotten, to breathe without shame. Outside, snow melted into streams that carried secrets down the mountainside. Inside, the fire glowed against the walls, illuminating faces lined with pain, but softened with fragile peace. Ethan sat among them, listening to the quiet murmur of voices. And though he did not ask for it, he knew Iron Hollow was becoming something larger than himself. Spring thaw gave way to a soft green across Iron Hollow, the garden rising with stubborn shoots, the cabin alive with quiet footsteps and murmured conversations of men who had begun to believe they might still belong to the world. Ethan rose early each day, mending the roof, hauling buckets from the spring, sitting with veterans who carried their own heavy shadows. It was not easy, but it felt honest. One morning after Richard's staff triangulated Ethan's last phone ping and Grace's GPS trail, the rumble of engines shattered the fragile peace. Ethan sealed the files back into the waterproof tin, slid it under the floorboards, then stepped outside, blinking into the sunlight to see a convoy of black SUVs grinding up the muddy path. Doors opened in perfect choreography, and men in suits stepped out, followed by a film crew already hoisting cameras onto their shoulders. At the center of the procession stood Richard Cole. Polished, as ever, his suit pressed his smile unshakable. Ethan Richard called warmly, as if nothing had fractured between them. "Look at you, son. You have done something remarkable here." He spread his arms toward the cabin, the spring the men gathered uncertainly at the edges of the clearing. "This is a symbol. This is exactly what the nation needs right now." Ethan felt his stomach tighten, already sensing the performance unfurling. Richard walked closer, hand extended, his voice pitched for the cameras. "Imagine this place as a national center for recovery, a sanctuary for veterans across the country. With my platform and your story, we can bring Iron Hollow to every household in America." The reporters scribbled the cameras, zoomed, and Ethan realized the cabin had been transformed in his father's mind from refuge into stage prop. Richard gestured toward the spring, still steaming in the cool air. "We will have funding, doctors, media coverage. This will secure not only your legacy but the family's. You will not be alone anymore." His tone carried both persuasion and command. Ethan felt the veterans watching him, their faces taut with unease, men who had finally found silence now confronted with microphones. He clenched his fists, pulse hammering. "No," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the clearing. Richard blinked, thrown off for a fraction of a second, then recovered with a politician's poise. "No, son, you cannot mean that. This is your chance to turn pain into purpose, to serve again." Ethan stepped forward, anger sharpening his words. "You are not here for me. You are not here for them," he said, gesturing at the veterans behind him. "You want a backdrop. You want a symbol to parade in front of cameras. You do not care about the men in this cabin, about what they carry. You only care about the story you can sell." Gasps rippled among the press pool microphones, thrust closer lenses, snapping shots of father and son squared off. Richard's smile faltered. "You do not understand what you are throwing away? Richard warned, his voice low, but caught by the microphones anyway. Ethan's jaw tightened. I understand exactly. You only want a symbol. You do not want a man. The words cut the air like steel. Grace, who had arrived quietly with the entourage, covered her mouth, her eyes wide with pain, while Eleanor stood in the shadows, silent as always, but trembling. Richard's expression hardened, the public mask slipping just enough to reveal the iron beneath. You think you know the truth? He asked coldly. You think your grandfather's journals told you everything? Ethan narrowed his eyes. Richard stepped closer and guided Ethan into the back of an idling SUV, closing the doors to speak in private. I was the one who signed the papers, Ethan. I was the one who buried Iron Hollow. The clearing fell silent, except for the hiss of the spring. Ethan stared at him, breath caught. Richard's words hammered deeper than any blow. Those men, those so-called experiments, you think they were secrets to me? I approved the cover-up. I chose the family's survival over scandal. Your grandfather begged me not to, but I did it. And I would do it again. His eyes blazed, half defiant, half haunted. Everything you cling to here is built on a lie I preserved. That night, a staffer's hidden recorder leaked the audio to the press. Headlines erupted, questions hurled like stones. Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. The veterans murmured uneasily, their fragile sanctuary cracked open by the revelation. Grace sobbed openly now, unable to hold back. Richard lifted his chin, as though daring his son to condemn him. Ethan stood rooted, every muscle tense, his grandfather's journal heavy in his memory, the classified files still hidden under the cabin floor. The truth had not only reached him, it had been passed down from his own bloodline. The clearing had not recovered from the storm of cameras, and words his father had unleashed. The veterans who once came in silence now shuffled uneasily, whispering to each other, some leaving before dawn, their eyes downcast. The spring still steamed, but its calm no longer soothed Ethan. He sat alone on the porch, shoulders hunched, staring at the journal on his lap without turning a page. The cabin felt heavier now, its walls closing in, with the weight of secrets and betrayals. His father's confession reverberated through him, a poison that spread with every heartbeat. The legacy he thought he was reclaiming was tainted, his refuge built atop lies his own blood had protected. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion coursing through his body. What am I even doing here? He whispered to the empty woods. Grace found him there at dusk, her face pale, streaked with tears she had tried to hide. She knelt beside him, clutching his arm. Ethan, please do not leave this place. Do not let him take it from you. If you walk away, everything grandfather tried to protect, everything you have built here, it all disappears. Her voice cracked, her grip trembling but firm. Ethan could not meet her eyes. I cannot carry this anymore, Grace. I do not want to be a monument to pain. I do not want to live inside his shadow or Dad's lies. Maybe it is better if I disappear. The words tasted like defeat, heavy and final. Grace shook her head, tears spilling freely. You do not see it, do you? To them, you are hope. To me, you are the only part of this family that has not given up. If you abandon this cabin, if you abandon yourself, then we lose everything. Her plea tore at him, but the hollowness inside remained. He rose abruptly, pacing the porch, fists clenched. What if this is a curse? What if all I am doing is repeating the same mistakes? What if survival is just another form of surrender? The next day, Doctor, Helen approached him quietly as he worked half-heartedly at stacking wood. She studied his face, seeing the cracks of despair deepening. You are thinking of leaving, she said plainly. Ethan did not answer. Helen placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice low and steady. There is something you need to know, something no one ever told you. Your grandfather did not die peacefully in his sleep. He took his own life. Ethan froze, his breath catching. Helen's eyes glistened with old grief. The army was closing in on him. He wanted to speak, to expose what had been done here, but they would have silenced him. He chose his own end rather than live as their prisoner. I was there, Ethan. I buried the truth with him because I thought it would protect his family. The revelation struck harder than his father's words. Ethan stumbled back, shaking his head. No, he whispered. They said he died old, worn but content. Helen's gaze did not waver. That is the story they wanted you to believe. But the truth is this: he carried the weight alone until it broke him. Ethan's knees buckled, and he sat heavily on the step, staring at the dirt beneath his boots. He saw his grandfather's handwriting in his mind, words about endless nights, about fear and guilt. Now those words seemed like farewells written in advance. A hollow ache spread through Ethan's chest, the kind that whispered of endings. He pressed his hands to his face, and in the darkness behind his eyes he saw a reflection not of the man he was, but of the man his grandfather had been fighting the same shadows caught in the same cycle. When he lowered his hands, his voice was raw. Maybe this is how it ends for me too. Maybe it is the only way to stop the circle. Helen knelt beside him, her voice stern. That is the lie the darkness tells. Your grandfather thought the same, but look at the wreckage it left behind. You are not bound to his fate unless you choose it. That night, Ethan could not sleep. He walked to the spring steam curling around him, the stars sharp above. He thought of the boy he had saved from the cliff, the words that still haunted him. If you give up, we have nothing. He thought of Grace's tears, of Helen's confession, of his father's corruption, of his grandfather's despair. The circle of it all pressed in like a tightening noose. He waded into the water, the heat wrapping around his body, and stared at the reflection trembling on the surface. For a moment he saw not himself, but his grandfather's face lined with sorrow and pleading for release. The image nearly pulled him under. His breath came ragged, his heart pounding as if urging him to choose. The storm came without warning, as if the mountain itself had been waiting to test him. Hours before dawn, the sky split open with a roar, lightning illuminating the peaks, thunder shaking the fragile cabin walls. Ethan awoke to the crash of trees splitting under the weight of wind and rain. Grace burst into his room, hair plastered to her face, eyes wide with fear. The creek is overflowing. It is coming down the slope. Her words were drowned by the roar outside. Ethan threw on his soaked uniform jacket and rushed into the night. Sheets of rain poured down, turning the ground into rivers of mud. The springs steamed violently, their warmth overwhelmed by the icy torrents surging from higher ground. The cabin groaned as water battered its foundations. Veterans who had been resting nearby stumbled into the clearing, their faces pale with terror, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. Helen emerged last, her lantern barely holding against the storm. Ethan's mind snapped into command, as if the battlefield had returned. "Get everyone to higher ground," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He grabbed Grace's hand, thrusting her toward the trail. "Guide them, do not stop." She nodded, trembling but determined. The group moved like shadows against the violent rain, Ethan at the rear watching the surge chase them. Branches snapped overhead, boulders tumbled, and the mountain itself seemed to shudder. Behind them, the cabin took the first blow from the flood part of its roof, caving with a sickening crack. Ethan's chest tightened, memories colliding with the present. He saw not wood breaking, but the steel walls of Humvees crushed in ambushes, heard not rain, but mortars' screams of brothers falling. One of the veterans slipped his leg trapped beneath a rolling log. Ethan leapt without thinking, mud swallowing his boots as he pulled the man free, straining against the weight. Water rose to his chest, icy and merciless, dragging at both of them. Grace turned back, screaming his name, but he forced a grin through gritted teeth. "Keep moving," the man stumbled forward, limping but alive. Ethan's lungs burned as he fought through the current, dragging himself to solid ground. The flood surged past, carrying debris that slammed against the cabin's frame. With each impact, the structure shuddered closer to collapse. Helen caught his arm as he staggered up the trail, her voice firm despite her age. "We cannot save the cabin, Ethan. We save the people." He nodded, though pain flickered across his face. The cabin had become more than wood and nails. It was his refuge, his confession, his second chance. But now it groaned like a wounded soldier breaking under forces no man could resist. He turned to the group huddled on the slope, their eyes on him, searching for orders, for hope. He raised his voice again. We hold here. We make a line. No one gets left behind. For hours they fought. They formed chains, pulling each other across torrents, carrying the weak on their shoulders, shouting over the storm. Grace clung to an old vet's arm, guiding him step by step. Helen wrapped torn cloth around bleeding hands. Ethan threw his body against fallen beams, carving paths where water threatened to sweep them away. Every moment mirrored battles long past, but this time he was not fighting enemies. He was fighting nature chaos and the despair gnawing inside him. As dawn bled into gray, the worst of the flood struck. A wall of water surged from the gorge, smashing into the cabin. Ethan turned just in time to see the roof collapse entirely. The walls fold, the place vanish under churning black water. The sight drove a knife through him, and for a heartbeat, he could not move. His grandfather's journal, the artifacts, the roof he had built with his own hands, all swallowed in seconds. He stumbled to his knees, in the mud rain pounding his bowed head. In the roar he heard voices not present, not alive, but echoing from memory. The men he had lost, their laughter, their final cries, their calls for him. "Ethan, why you and not me?" one voice accused. Another whispered, "We died for you." Another sharp, "Do not waste it." The weight crushed his chest, dragging him back into that night when smoke and fire had torn his unit apart. He gasped, clutching his head ready to surrender, but then through the storm his mind seized on Grace's voice crying out Helen's orders steady, the veterans clinging to each other. They were here. They were alive. They looked to him not as a fallen hero, but as someone who still breathed, still chose. He rose to his feet, mud streaming from his uniform, and screamed into the storm with every ounce of rage and love in him. "I live for you. Do you hear me? I live for you." His words ripped through the thunder, his chest heaving, his body trembling with the release. For the first time, he did not run from their ghosts, he claimed them. He stood not as a fraud, not as a figure on a stage, but as a man willing to fight for life for the living and the dead alike. The storm raged on, but the group endured. They moved higher, finding a ledge where the flood could not reach. Ethan collapsed onto the rock, his arms around Grace and Helen, the veterans huddled close. They watched the water swallow the clearing where the cabin had stood. The place was gone, but the people remained. Ethan's chest still burned, but it was not from fear. It was from the force of choosing life, when death had always whispered louder. The storm left Iron Hollow in ruins, but when the sun broke through the clouds days later, the mountain seemed to breathe again. Trees lay uprooted the ground, scarred, and where the cabin once stood strong, now rested only a mangled skeleton of beams and stone. Ethan walked the perimeter slowly, his boots crunching on wet debris, his breath heavy in the crisp morning air. He thought of surrendering, of leaving the wreckage to time, but then he saw the faces of the veterans gathered nearby, Grace with mud still in her hair, Helen leaning on her cane but steady as ever. They did not see defeat in the ruins, they saw a foundation. One man lifted a fallen beam, another began stacking stones, and without speaking, they started to rebuild. Ethan picked up a length of timber, his muscles aching, but for the first time in years, the pain felt purposeful. He was not patching up a shell of a home for himself alone. He was laying the groundwork for something larger, something enduring. As days passed, the community grew. Locals arrived with supplies, younger veterans carried tools, even farmers from the valley below brought food in exchange for a few hours of labor. Iron Hollow, once forgotten, buzzed with voices and hammers echoing against the mountainside. Grace worked tirelessly, tending to the injured from the storm, and offering comfort with a gentleness that reminded Ethan of their mother. One evening she told him she had enrolled in a nursing program at the nearest college. "I want to do this right, Ethan. If this place is going to help people, it needs more than just your strength and my stubbornness." He smiled, his chest tightening with pride. Grace had found her path, and in doing so, she anchored his. Meanwhile, Ethan made a choice that weighed heavily on him. From beneath the collapsed floorboards, he retrieved the waterproof tin where his grandfather's hidden records remained. For nights he pored over them, the rain-stained pages filled with evidence of experiments and cover-ups that explained why so many soldiers had suffered, and why his grandfather had carried unbearable guilt. Ethan knew keeping the truth buried would mean repeating the silence that destroyed the man he had looked up to. So one morning he drove down the mountain, walked into the offices of a major newspaper in Washington, D.C., and laid the files on a reporter's desk. His voice was low, but steady. Tell it straight. No angles, no politics. Just the truth. Within weeks after the paper's legal team verified the documents and redacted personal data, the story spread nationwide. Military officials scrambled, congressional hearings were called, and his father's political career collapsed under the weight of exposed signatures. Watching the broadcast in the corner of a diner, Ethan felt no joy at his father's fall, only a solemn relief that the burden was no longer hidden. The truth was finally free. Reporters hunted Ethan afterward, knocking on doors offering money for interviews, asking for photographs of the hero soldier turned whistleblower. He turned them all away. When they finally caught a glimpse of him, it was not at a press podium, but in the background of a news clip, sweat streaking his face. Shirt sleeves rolled, carrying beams with other men to frame a new roof. No medals shown on his chest, only the raw humanity of labor. To the world, it was a fleeting image. To Ethan, it was the only one that mattered. Helen, too, found her own task. She began writing her handwriting neat across worn notebooks, recounting the days when she and Ethan's grandfather had turned the cabin into a refuge for deserters and the broken a truth, once silenced, now given voice. People need to know what really happened, she told Ethan one evening as the fire crackled. Your grandfather fought not with bullets at the end, but with compassion. It cost him everything. But maybe if the world reads it, it will not cost the next generation the same. Ethan nodded, understanding now that legacy was not about monuments or medals, but about the courage to live honestly. As summer warmed the hollow, the cabin rose again. This time it stood broader, its frame reinforced by dozens of hands, its walls built with stone from the mountain, and timbers carried by both the young and the old. Grace hung a small cross of twigs over the doorway. Veterans carved their initials into beams. Children of locals laughed as they painted shutters. Iron Hollow was no longer Ethan's exile. It was everyone's sanctuary. When the roof was finished, they held a gathering. There was no ceremony, no press, just food shared under lantern light and music played on a battered guitar. Ethan stood outside for a moment, watching through the window as people laughed, sang, and filled the rebuilt space with warmth. He touched the wall where he had hammered the last nail, the grain of the wood rough beneath his calloused palm. Behind him, the wind carried scents of pine and wet earth, and above the stars stretched endlessly. Later that night, alone in the main room, Ethan hung his faded Marine uniform on the wall. The fabric was worn, stained, and scarred, like his own skin, but it deserved a place of rest. He stepped back and studied it, then whispered softly, his voice breaking in the silence. This time I will live, not as a medal, not as an image, but as a man. The words lingered, settling deep into the beams, into the soil, into himself. If you've followed Ethan's journey all the way to this ending, I'd love to hear from you. Which moment struck you the most? Was it his confrontation with his father, the storm that tore down the cabin, or the quiet decision to rebuild as a man rather than a symbol? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story spoke to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one.